For the updates, we will check in with you later. Very good. Tell me your reaction to this. I mean, we expected, and I suppose it's rather illustrative to see this regime acting in this way while the Pope is really in the perimeter of the Pope's Mass. It's kind of by the book for the Cuban regime.
Well, we heard yesterday from Raul Castro that the UN Charter is fully in force in Cuba. We also heard that the Cuban Constitution guarantees freedom of religion. Well, not for those people who want to circulate some information to their fellow citizens. It is a police state. The Pope is there, of course, to bring a message that's different. And I'm very glad in this gift of books that he's, highlighting for Fidel Castro and for everyone who's paying attention. You have to get your soul in order with God. And what you learned as a child from this wonderful Father Llorente, go back to it. Go back to it. These tactics remind me of East Germany and the Soviet Union. They're no longer around. So perhaps Cuba should pay attention.
And there's some video there in the double box. You could see some of the video of those arrests taking place. This was, again, on the perimeter of the Mass, and really in full view of journalists, of everybody, which is unfortunate in one respect, illustrative in another. We got some emails. In fact, there was one that came in earlier today, and it was talking about the nature of our coverage and complimenting you all particularly. And I'll read this to you because I think it bears airing. As a Cuban watching the Mass from Havana, I have to thank you and show my gratitude to Robert Royal, Father Murray, and Father Sid for saying the truth about our country. Usually it is not said as it is, and both of them know well, all of you, what you're talking about. I can just say thank you for letting the world know the truth. Many blessings. Continue being the messenger of truth when a lot of people have it all wrong. What's happening here? May God bless you all, and thank you for teaching the truth. And that was from Maria. So that's a very edifying, nice thing to hear. Sad that we have to report these things, but I think we get nowhere. I mean, the Pope is a great advertiser of this notion that we have to apprehend reality and face it as it exists. We can't live in some fantasy world. And I think too often, particularly with the Castro regime, people have sort of lived with the blinders on. The Pope is about to meet Raul Castro. You're getting some images here of the outside of the Revolution Palace, the so-called Revolution Palace in Havana. The Pope will be meeting here with Raul Castro. We don't know quite how in-depth this video will be or what we'll see of this meeting. My sense is this is going to be not unlike President Obama's meeting with the Pope later in the week, when they will meet, they'll have a public ceremony, and then the real meeting will happen behind closed doors. But what do you expect from this? What can we expect from this meeting?
Well, I think we're going to see some more boilerplate on the Castro side. As Father was saying, I mean, first of all, what country announces that the UN Universal Declaration of Rights is in force in its country? France doesn't do this, America doesn't do this, Italy doesn't do this. It's assumed that a decent country has already implemented steps that allow human rights, freedom of religion, etc. The fact that that is asserted is one of the biggest lies that you can possibly tell in a police state like Cuba. And as awful as it was to see that footage of those protesters, the whole world now is seeing quite openly, when its attention is focused on a little country like Cuba, what in fact is going on in that island.
Actually, the Vatican, I literally just got this. I'll tweet this out to everybody. You can find it on my Twitter page in a second. Alex Castro, Fidel's son, just tweeted a picture out of the Pope shaking hands with Pope Francis. So the Vatican must have put the kibosh on these pictures because they didn't want to have that photo of the Latin Pope in any way endorsing, in a bold way, Fidel Castro. Yet the photo has emerged from the Castro family. This is kind of operating procedure.
Well, I mean, everybody wants to have their picture taken with the Pope. Everyone wants to claim the Pope for their ID or their side, but the Pope is beyond that. I think that he takes calculated risks as any priest does. You know, as John Paul II did, for example, when he met with the Iraqi foreign minister a few days before the beginning of the war. Not that he endorsed Saddam Hussein, he was just trying to discharge his duties as successor of Peter. And similarly, the Pope is the universal shepherd. He's concerned about the souls of every single human being.
Fidel Castro is no longer the head of this country. There's no good reason for him to make
but I mean, perhaps they requested it. Who knows, you know? And I think that perhaps the Pope exhorted him to conversion. I mean, the fact, as Father was pointing out, those catechetical books. I mean, the man is what, 88, 89?
Yeah.
He's already at the threshold of his particular judgment by Christ. So he'd better get ready. And the Pope, as a priest, is urging him to get ready, I guess.
Yeah. The sands of time are wearing down for poor Fidel Castro, or not so poor. But anyway, the picture is out there. In fact, we will try to put it up for you a little later. I want to move on to something that's happening in a backdrop of this meeting. There has been this huge restoration of the relationship between the United States and Cuba. Pope Francis was at the very center of that. This is a clip of President Obama talking about this newfound relationship and the man responsible for it.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries. In particular, I want to thank His Holiness Pope Francis, whose moral example shows us the importance of pursuing the world as it should be, rather than simply settling for the world as it is. What do you
see there? What are you hearing there? It seems as if the president is obviously trying to use the Pope as well to propel this, the lifting of the embargo, which is part of this restoration of the relationship. I want to call everybody's attention before we go on. Pope Francis limping a little bit. He's really limping badly since the Mass this morning. There he is meeting with Raul Castro, and we can't hear the conversation, but they're laughing and joking a little bit here as this official meeting of the Pope with the President of Cuba. Now, some of our correspondents, even in Cuba, were registering their disdain for using the title President when referring to Raul Castro, in that he really wasn't elected, but that this is a dictatorship.
It's a dynasty, as the Pope said in his opening remarks yesterday.
Full military honors there, guard is in place. The Pope, Father Steve, you were talking earlier about the Pope suffering from sciatica, that this is a long time.
Yeah, it is well known that he suffers from sciatica, so, and he may have, I don't know, a bout, perhaps that's why he's limping, you know.
Yeah, he's really limping. This morning at the Mass it was noticeable, but now you can see he's really sort of...
Now it's the elevator, I think if you remember from when we did Benedict, remember that they took him on the elevator?
Yes, yes. Look, there's the elevator. Just went into the Get Smart elevator. Now, that may be the last image we get of this meeting, okay? We had been promised a meeting. Well, they're pretty flowers.
That's the upper floor of the elevator. There you go.
Oh, here we go. Okay, this does continue. This is really like a reality show. We've got cameras in every room. And there the Pope is making his way here to meet with officials in the Cuban regime. Having already met with Fidel Castro earlier today, here he is with his brother Fidel. This is EWTN's live continuing coverage of the Pope. Every moment of his visit in Cuba, we will bring it to you straight through his arrival here in Washington, D.C., to New York, to Philadelphia, and as he takes off for Rome. It's going to be quite a week, and it's already been an incredible few days here. Pope is making his way in.
I think it's the same place where we saw Benedict with Castro. Now they're going to sit.
Right, they'll go to the end of that hall and then sit, yeah. And while we wait for the Pope and Raul to be seated here, this is the picture of Fidel Castro meeting with Pope Francis a little earlier today. The Pope went to visit him at his home, which some describe as a sort of swanky nursing home in some of the reports I've read. There's that photo. He's in his jogging suit, ready to run a marathon, I guess is the message there. But this was taken by Castro's son, apparently, and tweeted out. And naturally, we all got our hands on it pretty quickly. Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, shaking hands with Raul Castro back in the presidential palace of the Revolution. Other members of the papal party being introduced to Raul Castro. Again, this is sort of a protocol of every visit. This is the Pope wearing his head of state hat. Tell us the difference, Father Jerry.
Well, the Pope, as the head of the Catholic Church, the Supreme Pontifex, the Bishop of Rome, is a spiritual leader, but he is also the head of state of the Vatican City State. Now, the Holy See is very careful that they maintain that diplomatic relations are established between the Holy See, an institution of international juridical right, with the different governments. But of course, in his capacity as head of Vatican City State, he receives the honors and protocols associated with being head of government, head of state when he travels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a key distinction. That's Father Lombardi, the Jesuit head of the communications apparatus of the Vatican, who was shaking hands with Raul Castro. It's very difficult to hear what they're saying.
I'm not getting any audio.
You're not getting any audio.
So I think we
I'm
just
getting a very faint.
Have to see what's being done. These look like members of the Cuban.
Yeah, it's all sort of ambient
regime.
Sound at this point, so
Yes.
we really don't have a sense of what's being said. But it seems to be just
This is all
general
this is
protocol and
stuff.
introductions.
It's normal.
Yeah.
You know, harking back to President Obama just a few minutes earlier, ran that cut.
Yes.
It's interesting that he invokes the Pope when it comes to the issue of Castro in Cuba, but he will not listen to the Pope when it comes to religious liberty in this country. And that's something I hope the Pope is going to speak about forcefully, especially in Philadelphia and also in Congress. You know, it's nice to have some window dressing to support your foreign policy. The way this country treats its religious members, that's even much more important. And I'm sure the Pope's going to remind us of that.
No doubt. No doubt. And you are watching live coverage. That is Raul Castro and Pope Francis, having gone through the protocol, the introductions of their respective parties, their entourages. They are now retiring to a private meeting. And if Pope Benedict's visit with Castro gave us the model, they will now retire. You see the two of them now walking alone into this section of the Palace of the Revolution. And I don't know how long this portion is actually supposed to go on until 5 o'clock Eastern, so a full hour of this meeting, which seems a bit long. I'll bet it wraps up sooner than that by the looks of things. Oh, and there it's exactly the same setting as Pope Benedict's meeting.
With a lush tropical setting.
Yes. It looks like they're in a botanical garden and on the deck, the marble deck.
And no translators needed on this one.
It's a very interesting.
Although interpreters.
No.
Interpreters always needed.
Yeah. Raul Castro is checking his camera there. How long do we have? I was asking the same question, Mr. President. He was checking his watch there. But this, again, talk about the impact of having a native speaker from the region, at least, if not the country. It is a different sort of conversation.
That makes it more intimate, I think, and it allows the Pope the opportunity to be direct. I think that, again, the Pope never forgets that he's a priest, and he sees himself first and foremost as a priest. All popes do, but this one in particular. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps there's a call to conversion. There's an exhortation to turn to God, you know. I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure Castro would like to stall and tell him about the achievements of the revolution and things like that. Mm-hmm. But thinking about Francis and the way we see him act, he sees himself as a priest ministering to somebody who is on a path to perdition, and the Lord Jesus shed his blood for every single human being that ever was, is, or will be. Mm-hmm. So priests have to be his presence and lead, especially the strayed sheep, back to Christ. You know, so
Yeah, no, that's what this moment. I mean, it almost looks like they're having a confession here. By the,
it looks
you know, all you need
it
is
looks like,
all we need is a
yeah.
screen in between
Exactly.
them.
It would take a lot longer than an hour.
or a stone, or
Pope
somebody to
Springs
bring,
eternal, Robert.
for somebody to bring a stone to the Pope. You know?
Yeah.
But I mean, but we have to hope for that. The man obviously
Absolutely.
has a hardened heart.
Sure.
The man is responsible for horrible crimes.
Yes.
But as Christians, we have to hope against hope that he turns back to Christ
Yeah.
and opens his heart to the healing grace of Christ for the good of Cuba, for sure, but also his eternal salvation is at stake. So
I think it's significant.
sure.
Yeah, the Cuban Revolution started with a rejection of Christianity, although when they were in the Sierra, they claimed to be Catholic and defending the church, but very quickly their agenda was clear. They became the biggest allies of the Soviet Union. They sent armies over to Africa to support other guerrilla movements. They are terrorists in South America.
They expelled priests.
They expelled
Even
priests.
some of them who were born in Cuba. There's
Yeah.
the famous case of the auxiliary bishop of Havana,
Yeah,
Bishop
Maza
Bosa Masvidal,
Masvidal.
who ended up in Venezuela, and who the priest who later became Bishop Roman in Miami, who was kicked out of Cuba, together with many other priests. Those are the two most famous cases. Some of them Spanish, some of them foreigners,
right.
some of them Cubans were kicked out. We mentioned Belen, the Jesuit school in Havana, who was seized and turned into a military academy, and Belen now functions in Miami. The Villa Marista of the Marist brothers was seized and turned into a prison.
Yeah.
The Agustinian University, Santo Tomás de Villanueva, was seized and closed down, and it now operates in Miami as St. Thomas University, and the list goes on and on and on.
You are seeing